Hi everyone, welcome back to Life Technologies YouTube channel, and thank you so much for watching and supporting our content. So if you are watching this video or you've watched our previous videos and you liked them, kindly hit that subscribe button to support our channel and also to stay tuned for more upcoming videos. So this is another episode of our IPRAN Training Series. Remember, in this series we discuss how to configure, how to design, how to troubleshoot IPRAN technology for service provider networks. So in our previous episode, we've discussed how to the general architecture of IPRAN network. We've also discussed how to configure, how to design different networking protocols like ISIS, BGP, MPLS on the IPRAN network. In our last few episodes, we discussed how to deploy the mobile services. So when deploying mobile services, we mentioned that normally we use the SRAN solution that allows us to use one hardware to deploy multiple radio access technologies like 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G. We have also discussed the HVPN solution, the hierarchical VPN architecture that is used to deploy mobile services on the service provider network. We've discussed and demonstrated how to configure HVPN and HOVPN on IPRAN network. So if you haven't watched these episodes, kindly check them out. They will help you to understand how to configure, how to troubleshoot these protocols on IPRAN networks. So in this episode, we are focusing on how to deploy enterprise services on IPRAN network. Remember, apart from mobile services, another key service that is running on service provider network is the enterprise service. So you realize that we have businesses. These businesses have offices in remote areas. And at the end of the day, they want to have communication from one remote office to another remote office, or they want to access the internet. And we know that they can go with list line. They can choose to connect one of their site to another site using a fiber, like you have a physical connection from one side to the other with your own fiber, but this is very expensive. So they end up having to lease some services. They buy some services from the service provider networks. And for service provider networks, they cannot also construct different networks for different customers. So what we do is we end up using the same underlying network to deploy services for different customers. So you can see that in this setup, you have different customer offices in different locations connecting to different nodes. So in this setup, we are connecting to CSGs in different locations. It could be connecting to ASGs, it could be connecting to RSGs, depending on the network setup. So once you have connection in this side, you could be required to ensure that we have connectivity from this side to the other side, or we need also to have connectivity from this side connecting to the CSG just to the another side connecting to the CSG. So this is a kind of a local connection. But also we can have a requirement that we need to have communication from this side to the side connecting to the RSG on this side, or even this side connecting to this side. So you end up having to configure what we call the layer 2 VPNs to transparently carry the services for different customers. So I've mentioned that in this setup, the IPRA network is acting as the MPLS backbone. So these CSGs, the ASG, the RSGs will be acting as the provider edge routers for different setups. And then the customer equipment will be the customer edge router. So we have this one acting as the PE. We also have the RSG acting as the PE. We have the SG acting as the P. But I've mentioned that sometimes you can have a customer connecting to the ASG depending on the location. We can also have another customer connecting to the ASG, and we need to ensure that we can achieve connectivity between these customers if they belong to the same customer. And sometimes I've also mentioned that sometimes we need access to the internet. So this customer here requires access to the internet, and maybe the internet definitely is connected to the service provider network, maybe the core network, and the IPRA network is connected to the core network. So you have the core network here. This core network is connecting to the internet, and this customer requires that he should be able to access internet services via the service provider networks. So this one can also be configured as an enterprise service and provide internet services to the customer through our IPRAN network. So this is just an overview. In the next slide, we'll see different setups. I mentioned that we have two types of services. One is where we have point-to-point connection, and another one is where we have point-to-multipoint connections. So many times you find that they are point-to-point connection. This is customer A. Let me use a different color. So we have customer office here, and we also have another customer office here, and their requirement is to have communication from site A to site B. So this is a kind of a point-to-point connection. And sometimes we have multiple customers offices, so we can be having another office here connecting to this CSG for the same customer. And this customer require that he should be able to communicate. Maybe this is the HQ, the headquarters, and the others are branches. So they also require to be able to communicate to the branches in different locations. So this is a kind of point to multi-point connections. So for the point-to-point connections, we are using what we call the virtual private wire service. So many times we are configuring e-pipes, the pseudo wires on the service provider networks, and we are able to provide layer 2 services for the customers. So you can see that we have customer 1. This is customer 1, site 1, and we also have customer 1, site 2. And they are connected on different PEs. So the PEs could be the CSGs, could be the ASGs, could be the RSGs in different locations. Many times what we do is we have a connection. So the customer site, at the location where we have the PE router, we also have a customer router, and then the customer router will be connecting to the PE. Many times we could be doing 1G connection, we could be doing 100 meg, we could be doing 10G or even 50 gig depending on the customer requirement. So once we have connected the physicals and the ports are up, we configure an e-pipe. In Nokia we call it an e-pipe, on Huawei we are calling them pseudo wires, but general name, these are just virtual private wire services. So we configure a layer 2 VPN from this connection and drop it to this connection facing the customer. So we are only providing layer 2 services. So the services from the customer will be transported transparently on our service provider networks. So this kind of the tunnel that is deployed to carry the services for this customer. For the second customer, we also need to do the same. So we have a second customer here. We have customer site 2, customer 2 site 1, and customer 2 site 2. So for this customer, we also do the same. We configure a layer 2 VPN, an e-pipe or a pseudo wire from this point of connection to this other point of connection on P2. And then the customer is now able to configure a layer 3 VPN or even use any other kind of routing that they are choosing to ensure that they have communication from site 1 to site 2. So, and this is the tunnel that will be in charge of transporting the services for customer 2 from site 1 to site 2. So the customers feels like they have a direct connection. So it's still like a list connection all the way from customer 1 to customer 1 site 1 to customer 1 site 2. Similarly, customer 2 also sees it as a list connection, as a direct connection from site 1 to site 2. But we have provided a layer 2 VPN connecting the two customers in different locations. So the VPWS, the virtual private wire service, is used to provide point-to-point layer 2 connection service. So this is what we normally use to deploy services for customers that require only point-to-point connections through our service provider networks. And again, sometimes we have point-to-multi-point connections. So we use what we are calling the VPLS, Virtual Private LAN Service, to provide point-to-multi-point layer 2 VPN connections for our customers. So in this setup, you can see that we have This one could be the branches. This is the head office, site 1 being the head office, and then we have 3 branches. So we have site 1, site 2, and this is site 2, site 3, and site 4. And the customer requirement is that they should have communication between these branches and the HQ. So you end up having to configure a VPLS that will provide point to multi-point connections for these customers. So in this setup, it's a kind of the customer is connected to a layer 2 switch. So customer sees it as a layer 2 switch connection, and from the layer 2 switch connection, he can now be able to configure other services. He can configure dynamic routing protocol. He can configure BGP to ensure that he now has the communication from one side to the other, and he can have end-to-end connectivity from one side to the other. So these are the two options that are commonly used. I've mentioned VBWS, the virtual private wire service that provides point-to-point connection, and VPLS providing point to multi-point connections for different customers with branches or with different offices in different locations, and they require to have end-to-end communication for their sites. Also, I mentioned that sometimes they, of course, many times they also require access to the internet. So we could be having another connection to the internet somewhere here to the core network. And we also need to ensure that we have a mechanism that will ensure that these customers are able to access the internet via our service provider networks. So this is it for deploying enterprise services on the service provider networks. Just to emphasize again, we are either using point-to-point connection, the VPWS, virtual private wire service, or the VPLS, the virtual private LAN service, to deploy point to multi-point services. In our next episode, we'll be demonstrating how to do the configuration both for VPLS and VBWS, just so that you are able to see how we are deploying the enterprise services on our service provider networks. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and kindly remember to like, to comment, to share, and to subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more upcoming videos. See you in our next episode. Bye.